Hi everybody, I am here today to make a video about the basics of shading for miniature figure painting for hobbies, Dungeons and Dragons, and that sort of thing. Just going to show you a few of the figures that I've done in recent years, also some old ones that I had previously done without shading to show what a big difference it makes. And I'm also going to do live a couple of figures in time lapse where we'll show you how it looks without shading and then after the shading is done at the midpoint and then at the end stage. So shading is really good for figures because it really gives them sort of a nice depth and sort of more of a 3D textured lived in effect as opposed to looking more painted. In my painting, really like my figures to look as naturalistic as possible, obviously for mythical creatures that don't really exist. But I much prefer that look. It just sort of gives it a lived in, old, weathered look, the way things really would look, in this mythical sort of world. Just a little bit about me. I don't claim to be an expert at figure painting. I'm sure you can probably find other videos on YouTube of people using air guns and other things that's really, really more impressive than what I'm doing, and that's fine. I'm not here. I do this purely for fun. I haven't actually played tabletop role-playing games for a long, long time, but I did start doing the Dungeons and Dragons and painting the figures, more than 40 years ago, if you can believe it. Just a quick look at my setup. Like I said, I'm doing pretty much things the traditional old school way, and I just use hand brushes and paints, and these are I use water mostly and brush cleaner to clean the brushes. And there's all of my paints. Actually, not all of them. If you can believe it, actually a lot of these paints are the original Poly S Dungeons and Dragons Fantasy series. There's Dragon Blue, Dragon Red, and a whole bunch of those I still have. And yes, some of those I literally bought in the 1970s, and they are still going just fine. Some of them, I probably got about 8 or 10 of them that actually dried up. And so over time, I've kind of gotten into some of the more modern colors to try and replicate the ones that dried up as best as I could. I also have the raw Partha ones that were kind of a replacement to the Poly S, and those are great too. I love those. I've got a number of those. But anyway, so I just thought I'd start with just showing you a quick demonstration of non-shaded versus shaded figures. So here are some figures that I did, I don't know, 25 years ago, maybe more, I don't know. And these are all ones that I did that I think, they're nice figures and they're well painted, and I did a pretty good job on them back in the day. But you can see they have no shading, just like that green color on that cloak is just a flat green color. And here's this paladin, which I remember when I did him, I was probably a teenager when I did him, and I thought I did a really great job. And it's still a really nice figure. But now it looks kind of, unfinished to me, almost like the starting point. Here's an orc shaman, I think. Again, it's a really nice figure. It's well done. I think I picked some nice color shades. Some of these things you can actually see there. It's almost like there's a little bit of natural shading on this cloak, and that's just a factor of using old paint that wasn't quite saturated, so you kind of get a natural highlight and low light effect. Like if you can see in the lighting there, how you see shadows in the folds of his cloak and kind of high points along the high ridges. That's what we're really going for. So to give you a comparison and contrast here, let's look at these two gnomes, one with shading and one without. Let's see if my old camera can focus on you there. And I mean, he's a nice figure, but this is a very simple figure here, just a guy with a sling. But just the folds of his clothes and how I've got everything with the textures. I mean, I just think he's a spectacular. He came out. He's one of my favorite, even though he's a very, very simple, not super complicated figure. I just love him, and I think I did a great job on him several years ago, I think. This fire giant is actually one of the very first ones I did with shading back when I was first learning how to do it. And it's a fairly mild shade, really. I only kind of did his skin and his armor, and didn't really do too much else, like his armor plating, I did like his meshes of his armor there, but I didn't do his armor plating or his weapon or anything like that. But still, it's a really cool effect. As you can kind of see, he's got sort of the orange with the yellow highlights. You can see like that back panel across his back. I have no shading on that, and it kind of stands out now for not being shaded. Here's one I did pretty recently, kind of a overlord fighter figure, and just like look at his chainmail and how you get that beautiful depth that it really just looks like something that would be in a more or less would be a more realistic looking figure, and it's got some shading there on his decoration on top of his plume. Here's another one I did pretty recently that I was very happy with how he turned out. Wizard with the spell book and skull charm or whatever it is there. You can see like his beard has got a lot of nice texture. His cloak, and you can see it shows up in here, but like his embroidery, I've got some layering in there that makes it look good. Used a little bit of shading technique to make the lines of his book stand out. That didn't turn out super great, but it's not terrible. Part of the back, this inlay of his like a magical symbol on his cloak, kind of confounded me and didn't really come out how I'd liked it to. But still, it looks pretty cool. Here's a very simple figure, kind of a cleric figure. I mean, not much to him, just really his armor, weapon. But like, look at his plates of his scale armor and how they just really pop and look good. And like, down here, the depths of his underneath. But the basics of shading is that you want to have, you can see like shadows, emphasizing the shadows in the low spots, the interior portions, the creases, the things like that, and lighter shades on the high points, the highlights, as it were. And the way you achieve that is basically through a two-step process. Just a couple more real quick before we get started. Here's a nice wizard figure. Again, just like, very simple figure. He's just basically got his cloak, his inner cloak. He's got his familiar. But just by adding those layers of shading, I think he looks really nice. And here's one. This is probably one of my, I think, best figures that I've done, is a Lich. Which, boy, was he a pain. Because as I was painting him, I just kept uncovering more and more details on him that I hadn't really noticed when I started. Things like that there are portions of his clothing missing and where his bones are showing through. There's several of those that I kind of had to like go back through and get those done right. But just, obviously I wanted him to be very dark and sort of deteriorated looking figure. Like his cloak there really looks like it's something that's, been sitting in a crypt for hundreds of years. And like you see with his bones of his skeletal arms and his face, by adding those lowlights, that depth of shading, it really makes the low parts pop, and then a slight cast of yellow on his bones to kind of make them look aged. I think that's just comes out a really cool effect. So let's talk about how we do this. So to do shading on these figures is really a two-step process. And this is not stuff that you can do quickly. This is all stuff that has to be done against stages, and then you have to wait a while, typically overnight, to do the last part. And that's just because you need the paint to be completely dry before you can do things. So the first part is what we call a wash. And a wash is created by taking, these are all water-based paints, except for a few in here, which I just use for small details. Is you take water, and then you take, usually typical I'll do is, this is literally how I do it, I just take a straw here, dip it into water, put it on a surface like this, so you have a little bit of water there, and then I just take a brush in my wash color, and typically for doing a wash you want to have something with like a nice poofy end like that, because it's kind of a seemingly sloppy process, because you're just sort of slopping stuff on there seemingly quickly and without a whole lot of dexterity. But so typically, the way you do the washes is with you want a very, very dark color. Usually, you're going to use black for most of it. Um, and so you just take a little bit of your black and get it on the end of the brush, and you just put it into the water and create a wash. And I don't know what the exact ratio is, 10 to 1, maybe something like that, of water to paint. So the idea is that you just want to have a very, very light wash of color that you will then sloppily, literally sloppily, just kind of go over the parts that you want to do the wash in. And typically what you do is generally you use black for most washes, but you usually use it for the let's say the cool colors. And then you would typically maybe use dark brown, like something like this, for the hot colors, the warm colors. The warm colors would obviously be red, orange, yellow, things that are a nice warm color. So obviously we use a lot of brown wash here on this fire giant. You can particularly see in his skin. We used a brown wash on his skin to kind of bring out the depths there. That's actually not the right color skin for a fire giant, but like I say, I did that a long time ago. And then you will just sort of slop it on. Now, typically, when I'm doing a figure, I often will try and like have someone in all or mostly dominant warm colors, like this wizard, or mostly in cool colors, like this wizard or the lich. So I can just do a quick slop of wash on all of them. And so with that, the way you want to calculate that, how you know you got your wash mixed correctly, is so that when you put it over there, and we'll show you a demonstration here as I do this live, is that you want the color to seep in and stick to the low parts through gravity. It'll just hang in there and not cover the high parts. So if you usually should try and do this in a test area, like at a back or their leg or someplace inconspicuous. And if you're actually like, getting sort of a wash that actually covers the high points, that means it's too thick. You need to thin it out some more with some more water. And obviously if it's hardly sticking at all, that means it's too thin. You need more pigment in it. And so you take that and you let that dry. And here's the secret. You really have to let that dry few hours. I typically do it overnight. Like typically when I'm doing a wash, I will try and do the wash right at the end of the night so that the next morning or the next day, whenever I'm going to do the highlights, I can then do it. I know it's fully dry. I tried a couple times, to do that after only maybe an hour or two. And what I found was just, even though it looked dry, it wasn't fully dry. And it was tending to just sort of smear the stuff around. So then when you have your wash fully dry, then you take a brush that's kind of more like this. That's very, typically you want something that's very soft, not hard bristles. And what you will do with that is kind of the opposite of the wash. Is instead of a wash is very, very little pigment to water ratio, is a highlights is you want to have very, very high pigment and almost no moisture. In fact, you don't even want to have very much pigment on the end of your brush. Typically what we'll do, and again, we'll show this to you here, is that you remove most of it by rubbing it on towel or something like that between your fingers until there's hardly anything left. And then we'll use a motion that I'll demonstrate like this, which is you're just lightly brushing this across the surfaces that you want to highlight. And so the way highlighting works is, so the color that you would like to highlight, so in this case, let's say here is that inner part of his thing was kind of a medium green. You want to pick something for the highlight color that's at least 2 shades lighter than the base shade, because if you do something that's too close, the highlight won't really show up. So for instance, taking a look here, if I was doing something in like a medium darker green like that, then I would choose a very light green as my highlight. And you can probably figure out the same thing for blues. I would use very dark blue and very, very light blue. and so on. And you can kind of just figure, looking at your colors, what's the lighter portion, you know, a lighter red versus a very dark red versus a medium red. Um, or, you know, like a dark gray, like you can see on this wizard's cloak. He had a dark gray cloak that I highlighted in a lighter gray, and so on. So, for instance, if you had something that was like in a medium light gray, like that, you might actually do the highlight in a very, very light gray or even a white. And you want to have enough contrast there for it to show up, because if you don't use a big enough differential between the two shades, it just won't show up. Okay, so theory sounds great, right? So let's actually just show you how this works in process. And obviously this will be kind of be done time lapse. So you'll see the first portion here that I'm going to do right now. Next portion will take place tomorrow or whenever I get around to it here. So you see a couple of figures that I've done here with their base shade. So we've got a devil here. I just had a twin to him that I just did in red. So I thought I'd try the other one in blue just to change things up. I haven't done like his horns or his spear, trident, and things like that I would normally also shade, but for the purposes of this thing, we'll go ahead and do him. But you can see, looking at this figure, look at all the high points, like the ridges on of his wings and his musculature and his face, the cheekbones, all that kind of stuff. How just great potential for a figure that he's going to come out with there. I can see, looking at here, I've got a few spots that aren't quite filled in there that I must have missed or whatever, even though I think I did 3 layers on him. That'll actually get filled in by the black wash when we do it. And here is a gnome illusionist figure. I've been working on him, and I kind of deliberately with him kind of wanted to do, you know, very bold colors, almost ostentatious, but you know, he's an illusionist, so it'd probably be into color. But the other great thing about doing shading, particularly with the washes, is it will kind of like knock down the intensity of bright shades. So even though he looks like a little rainbowish there, you know, with his green cloak and his dark green or green mantle and his dark green cloak, and he's got a yellow top, and he's got some metal belt and fringe around his cloak and things like that, and his orb there. I know it looks almost garish, but take a look how he looks after we do him in a wash. All right, so I've still got a little water there, but since I'm going to be doing 2 figures, I want a decent amount of water to start. And you can probably see here that I typically, on my mixing palette, kind of use one side for black and one side for brown, and for other different colors as I want to. And let's see, now I think I've got too much water in there, but whatever. We'll just use a little extra paint. So I've got my black, and we're just going to dip in here. So we need a pretty good amount of paint since I've got a lot of water. And then we just put it in there, and you can see that mixing. I don't know how well you can see from that angle, but it's mixing pretty well. And boy, I've mixed up a huge amount of wash, really way more than I need. Yeah, that's almost kind of ridiculous. So you can see now, so I've got something here that is very, very light. And typically what I will do is I will take some paper towel, take the wash, and just run it over there to see what it looks like, to get an idea of how thick it is. It looks about right to me. So it's not super saturating to it, but it should leave a nice effect. So I think we're good with that. So I'm going to go ahead, put the black away, and why don't we start with? Well, why don't we start with the gnome? Just because I think the effect will probably be more dramatic on the larger devil. But so again here, so I am going to wash everything, his skin tones, everything, just because I think it'll really pop out. So at this point I have him almost 100% painted. I think he's got some rings that I haven't done, but little small details like that, straps, things like that, you can fill in with a base coat after your highlight effect, and it'll still look really good. So here we go. We're just going to, so typically I'll start with an inconspicuous area like that. Now you see that looks really good. I don't know if the light will show that up there. See how like those folds in the bottom of his thing, how It didn't really cover the front fringe, but the color, just gravity took it right into the low spots. And so here we're just gonna do the whole thing. And I know, again, looks like almost like a sloppy process. And you'll say, what are you doing? You're ruining your figure. Well, trust me, when all this shakes out, not all of the color that you see now is going to show up in the final effect. Because what's going to happen is, now you see here, I don't want to get too much wash on my thing. So there is pretty much the front. And you see the wash portion is pretty quick. I mean, this is not something that takes a ton of time to do it. Then you have to wait. I typically try and wait at least 6 to 8 hours after the wash is done before I do my highlights. So we're doing that across him, again through here. Again, this is a fairly sloppy process. Oh, you notice my technique of how I paint my guys is I just use Elmer's glue to glue my guys to a piece of cardboard so that I can hold them and manipulate them. I see people using like these very fancy rigs that look really cool, but also look a pain in the butt. So I don't use them. I just find this easier. So there we go. We got pretty much everything. And the cool thing about this is if you see, like you feel like you've got too much wash in one spot, you can just sort of dry off your brush here a little and just put it there while it's wet, and it'll actually absorb rather than leave the wash. But pretty cool. So I know you're probably looking at this and say that's too much. I see, like, they're on his face. I think that's probably a little too much on his face. So what I'll do is I'll take the pigment off of my thing and I'll just stick my brush in there, and look, it just absorbs a lot of that away. So I do want to have some highlights on his face, but that's a little too much. So overall, that's looking pretty good to me. Now, the challenge can be is if you are not doing a big sloppy wash on your entire figure. If you're doing like different washes in different colors on different spots, that can be a pain. And you typically just have to do that very carefully with a smaller brush, very, very light washes that you do in stages. Again, that can be a real pain. But anyway, so there's what our gnome looks like now with his wet wash. And again, when we see it next, it'll have dried and look much more subtle. So here's the the devil. Having just done another one of this in red, I know that the effect. So just look how that fills in beautifully in all those low spots. So we need a lot more wash on this guy since he's a lot bigger. He's a lot more surface area. And you can certainly see, maybe you can tell from this thing, but he has hairs on his legs and certain other portions. So for him, I will do his general wash in lighter blue, but for the hairy portions, I'll do it in whatever color, the highlight in whatever color I want his hair to be. Probably black. Maybe a very, very dark blue, something like that. And that way you can sort of have different effects of through your washes. And you can do all sorts of cool things beyond just the standard washes. Once you kind of get down the basic techniques, you can experiment with it and play around with different things. I've seen people do things that are really cool where, like, we do a wash that's in a completely different color than the base coat, just make it look cool. So for instance, like a white cloak base coat, and then you do a wash in like a medium green, so he kind of gets this cool effect of this greenish pallor to his white cloak. And that was so cool that I am totally going to steal that idea and try and use it on a guy that I do soon. So you can see just the gravity of the wash just fills in those low spots and makes it look really, gives it a lot more depth and subtlety, and just looks really cool. Again, that's how it looks freshly wet. All right, so I think he's looking good. Maybe a little more on the face and neck. Trying to make sure you're getting those little nicks and crannies like under the neck and in the armpits and things like that you want to make sure is also highlighted. A little too much right there. So I'll just kind of take that down a little bit. All right, so there is our devil. and our gnome illusionists after their wash. So when you see them next, we'll see them what they look like dried. Okay, and we're back, and through magic of time lapse, these two figures have now completely dried overnight. Trying to get some good light on here, and you can see what they look like now with the black wash having dried. Now you can see that effect is much more subtle after it has dried for a bit. And so you can see all like the dark nooks and crannies and stuff have filled in. And you kind of just around the angles of his face and his nose and his hands there. Look at the shading on his wand. So you can see the back won't show up as quite so much just because it was already a very, very dark color, but you can probably see like the black in the creases of his cloak there. The devil, obviously much more dramatic. You can see all those natural highs and low planes have just now really become more accentuated and looks a lot cooler. But again, this is the midpoint now. So this is half of shading, the wash. Next we're going to do the highlights. And again, highlights is you, for the most part, pick a shade that's, at least a couple of shades lighter than your base color. So this is kind of a medium blue. So we'll choose a very light blue to do that for him. Obviously the gnome is more complicated because he's a bunch of different shades. And with all those small details on him and being a smaller figure in general, I'm not going to shade absolutely everything. I generally don't shade flesh unless it's supposed to be something really dramatic, like, giant flesh, or it's a different color or something like that. But here I will shade with highlights his blue cloak and his green mantle, probably his wand, probably his hat, maybe his boots, but that'll be about it. Maybe the tiny bit of his pants that are sticking out there. And to do that, again, we get, and I'll try and do a demonstration here to show you exactly how highlights works. Okay, and I have managed to set up a bit of a camera stand here to give you a better angle. Anyway, so here is our light blue. And so I'm actually going to do this devil in a couple different shades. I'm going to use the light blue for most of his body and his head. But for his wings, I'm going to do it in a slightly different color, in a purple, just because that will mirror what I did with his red companion. And it'll just show you a little bit of how you can use different shades of wash and highlighting in order to bring out the effect. So I dip in here, and then typically what I do is I bring over here to Mr. Towel, and I'm going to get rid of most of the moisture, and in fact most of the pigment. So I'll actually pinch this off here so that I've got, so you can see now, my test is if I'm doing this on a clean part of this, when I go like that, you can only see a tiny bit of pigment being left behind. And that is what we want to do. So we're going to do this here. So this is, you see this is kind of a smaller brush that I would use for highlighting in tighter areas. And again, you don't want to use a lot of pressure here. You just sort of lightly run it across the surface that you want to highlight. Now you can see right away there on his stomach how that's come out. So we do things like, so basically any part that's like a high point, so you can see like the knuckles of his hand, works really good on faces, especially one like this with a lot of definition. And again, this is not a super exact process. You're kind of just running your brush over. And I'm not going to do too much on the legs because you see he's got hair on his legs, and I'll go over that to highlight with black probably to make the hair stand out. Probably need a little bit more pigment. Again, you don't want a ton on here because if you do it, you don't want to be smearing. The idea is that as you're brushing past, you're creating just enough friction for the dense pigment that is still on there to be left behind. And again, it won't go down into the low parts. So like look at this tail hair before. You can probably guess there with those ridges, the high points of those ridges. See that? How that just brings them right out? point of his tail. So we'll do the back of his back. You can see how we're bringing out that musculature. So pretty cool. So that's, believe it or not, that's pretty much most of his body now. Let me get some of these little nooks and crannies. Just, you see how that just brings that right out? Get some more on his face, on his back here. Alright, so there's that. Okay, now for his wings, I'm going to change it up here a little bit. I'm going to use this purple here, which obviously is not on the same shade scale as the blue. It's close, but obviously has a lot more red in it. So for this, since we're going to do the wings, I'm going to use a larger brush here with a nice poofy end. And again, for this, we do not want to get a ton. I try to get a little bit up the sides, just a bit. Just so the idea is that as you're running it, you're not using the down point of the brush. You're using the sides of the brush as you swipe back and forth like this. So I'll remove most of the pigment. Doing my test here. I really should get a cleaner cloth. Here, let's try this. Using a clean cloth so you can see here, just running this lightly across, you can see right there that tiny bit of pigment that gets left behind. And again, that doesn't look like much, but it will definitely show up on the figure. So let's go ahead and do his wings real quick. And again, see, this is a very quick process. And in a situation like this, you know, I may start out and not like how it works out, and you can actually save this by just doing a small section and going over it again in a different shade that you prefer, because it'll again hit the same high points and give you a cover up the exact same parts that you just did. So there's a lot of ways you can kind of, without having to completely redo the whole shading process, and start over. So that's kind of interesting. It's not really leaving a super dramatic effect, but I just like the idea of his wings being a slightly different color. And again, I use this on a red guy, a very similar figure from the same set, and I really liked how, now you see how that when I do this, it's leaving that bit of pigment on the high points, especially on the ridges of his wings. It's like, look at that wing before. And now we'll go over it real quick. I don't have a lot of pigment left on here. I might need to do a little bit more, a little more paint. Okay. You may notice that when I first put fresh paint on this for highlighting, I will do a much lighter stroke to start, just to see how much pigment I've got on there and how much it's going to leave behind. You can see it starting to show up there on the edges of his wings, and especially on those ridges. It's a pretty subtle effect, but I do like it. So this is a good example of how you can use, and you can see I did not really get across here, so let's get in there, where you can use different colors of washes and shadings to achieve different sort of special effects that you really like. Let me do a little more on the back here, because I don't feel like I hit the... Alright, let's turn our attention to the gnome. Okay, and for the gnome here, now obviously, because he's got much smaller surface areas and we're not just sort of crazily doing the whole body, and we're only doing certain sections, we've got to be more careful. So that takes for a smaller dry brush. This is in fact a literally small dry brush, is this thing that I've got here. But again, you kind of got the soft, bristly end, not too stiff, not fairly fine bristles. In this case, it's just a much smaller brush. And see, it's a little bit frayed at the end. That's perfect. Perfect type of brush for small dry brush applications. Alright, so here's the green we're going to go with. It's just obviously a much lighter green down the scale of that kind of medium dark green that he's using. Same thing. Good. In this case, we don't need nearly as much pigment. We get that all on there. Get rid of most of it. So get rid of all them, as much of the moisture as you can. I generally tend to pinch them off like that. I see how much is being left. And again, so he doesn't really have any too many inconspicuous areas. So we'll be really careful. So I'll just start off very lightly across his sleeve here. And can you see that? Again, that's the thing about dry brushing, is it looks often really subtle when you're doing it. And you're like, this really doesn't make a big of a difference. But then when you look at the before and after, which we'll try and do at the end of the video here, you can really see how much more depth and texture it gives the figures. Now this will be fun down here with these fringe areas, a little bit of folds. Obviously, if a character is very flat and doesn't have lots of highs and lows and like folds in his clothes or weapons or things like that, you're not going to have as dramatic an effect. All right. And there, that was it. Okay, now to do the gnome's cloak, I thought I'd try look at you and show you what the options are here. So obviously, there's this cloak. It's a very, very dark blue. So what shade should we pick? Now there's kind of a very nice medium blue. But see, the contrast between the figure's cloak and that is really not that great. Maybe if you'd like, we can go ahead and quickly do a sample area using that color. And it probably won't really show up that well, just because what you need for highlighting with the dry brush is you really do need that high contrast between the shades. Otherwise, it just doesn't really show up. So we'll get most of our pigment off here. And I'll try to kind of get it in a low area here that I'm going to go over again with a lighter shade afterwards. Can you see that? That's kind of adding a little bit of almost like a purple effect. Which is not bad. So our other options would be go to a very, very light blue. I've got this one here, it's kind of a light blue-green. That might work, because then you can complement the green of his cloak. Or this bright blue, dragon blue as it's called. Or do we want to just stick with that? I don't know. See, to me, that is not going to be a super noticeable effect. But I don't know. Let me do a little more. We'll see. So you see across those high folds of there. Try and get the edges of his cloak. And you see the pigment will really stick on edges like that because it's a hard edge. So when you drag the brush across, you're really getting maximum friction there. I don't know. It's kind of growing on me. It is a very subtle effect compared to maybe what it was. It kind of, gives it almost a purplish aspect, which I don't know. I'm kind of digging it. Yeah, I'll tell you what. I think I'm going to stick with that, even though that's not a super dramatic highlight effect. I think it's just enough that in this case, we're not trying to make him look, have his cloak really pop. We just get that subtle, more 3D effect. Try and get into these parts here. It's harder to do these places. If I really wanted to get in there really good, I'd get back in there with a smaller brush. But I think I can do it with this probably. So I'm doing short strokes here. I'm trying to get really maximum friction so I can, in that small space, get the highlight. Yeah, I have to admit, I was skeptical, but I think that that looks pretty good. I'm obviously I'm not done with these guys. I've just kind of done the very basics. So I'll go in here. The gnome's close. I need to do a few details. I'll do shading on his wand and a few other his pouches, a few other small pieces there. Got to do his eyes and so forth. Devil has a lot more to do, but again, just kind of doing the basic body to show you what the effect of shading looks like. So anyway, that is our demonstration of the basics of shading for miniature figure painting, consisting of the two-step process of a wash with a very high ratio of liquid to pigment, and then highlighting with dry brushing, which by the name obviously very, very little. All right, thanks for watching the video. Sorry it was so long, but we'll try and give you a quick look here right at the end to show you the two figures at the three different stages to show you exactly how dramatic the shading effect can be. Thanks for watching.